I have two flaws that have affected HBCUs not only in this year's NCAA tournament, but then also tournaments of years past as well. Oh, yeah, it's Locked On HBCU. Play my music.
You are Locked On HBCU, your daily podcast covering HBCU sports. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, family? Welcome back to another episode of the Locked On HBCU podcast, your number one daily one-stop shop for everything HBCU athletics, Monday through Friday, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And I, of course, am Darian Gray, a.k.a. the Mouth of the South, Texas Southern alum and former TSU Herald sports editor and current contributing writer at USA Today's Saints Wire. Thank you for going on this journey with me. Make it Locked On HBCU, your first listen of the day, every day. And remember, just because the mic cuts off, and it will cut off, does not mean that the journey is over. It just means it's time to follow me on Twitter at South Exclusives. Starts with an S and ends with an S. Today's episode is brought to you by LinkedIn. In these days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business, and that's why LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the right people for your team faster and for free. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. Terms and conditions do apply. It's all about March Madness. That's what today is all about. We wrap up today's episode with a look at UConn head coach Gino Auriemma's comments about Jackson State's head coach Tamika Reed, Jackson State's scheduling during the season, how it affects their seeding during the NCAA tournament. There's a lot to unpack in there. Prior to that, we'll look at the pros and the cons from Jackson State's first round exit against UConn. But we kick off today's episode with just a blanket statement, a little bit more generic, and it's the two fatal flaws that I've seen plague HBCUs in the NCAA tournament for the last couple of years. I've been watching because Texas Southern has been there 3 years prior to this. I haven't been working on the job for all three of those seasons, but I have been watching my team. I've seen them in the years when I was in school as well. So I've watched HBCUs in the NCAA tournament, but not as closely, right? My eye wasn't trying to break it down. It was just, okay, let's watch my school. But since I've been watching it and breaking it down a little bit more, two fatal flaws I've seen that are pretty connected, but I want to separate them because I think they're different, is A, the lack of size, no brainer. So we'll get to that second. But then also the poor finishing on the offensive end near the bucket. And those two things do have to do with each other, right? They have a relationship, but they are not the same. And what I see is a lot of struggling finishing. Maybe it is because they're not used to going against players of that size, but I saw it with Norfolk State. I saw it with Grambling towards the beginning in both games, right? And then I also saw it with Howard, I think. Howard's the one I'm the least confident about. But I think Howard is a pretty good example, and so was Grambling in the first four, because this wasn't some 16 versus 1 matchup. This is just NCAA tournament stuff. And I could be missing this during the regular season. But in the games that I watched, I don't see players struggling to finish near the bucket as much as I have when March rolls around. When March rolls around, it's not always great plays by the opponent. Sometimes it just feels like, I'm used to you making that shot. This goes for players in the post. So maybe you got a big trying to get some post work going and trying to finish with a post move, or just trying to finish through some tall arms. But it's not just that. It's also driving to the bucket. It doesn't feel as efficient as it's been when I watch games in the regular season. That is a big problem. And I don't feel like it has to do all the way with the opponent. It just feels like, timely wise, this is the worst time to be struggling. And it feels like they struggle each time. So maybe I'm not giving the opponent enough credit, but I don't think it's the end all be all. Just to be very clear, I think it's some user error as well. But size does have to do with it. So let's go ahead and get to the bigger topic. Jackson State has recruited more size to be able to compete in these type of situations. We talked about that on yesterday's episode. Coach Reed has talked about it 2 years ago when they were in this predicament, right? I don't think that saying lack of size is some grandiose take. I really don't. But it does need to be said, right? Like, just because it's not something super deep or something you've never heard before, it doesn't mean it doesn't need to be said. That lack of size is a real thing. And I think that people could take from Jackson State and recruit better size. And I know you may say, well, look what happened to JSU. Their women's basketball team didn't win in the first round either, even with that size. Yes, that's true. That's a valid point. But I don't necessarily feel like size hurt them. And we'll get more into that in the second segment, but I don't feel like size really hurt them. And here's my thing. If most HBCUs, see, we speak about Jackson State. We speak about Jackson State women's basketball recruiting size in order to compete in the NCAA tournament. But then I also look at the fact that most HBCUs would have that same problem, which would mean most HBCUs would struggle against bigger teams. And I don't mean bigger schools. I mean size of player, bigger teams. So if now you go in and you recruit bigger players in size and stature, wouldn't that logically mean that they'll struggle against you? That's just how I'm looking at it. We look at recruiting for size in relation to the NCAA tournament because that's what Jackson State women's basketball did. But you could recruit bigger stature players and maybe lead to dominating your conference a little bit more. It's not a just get a big player, dominate. I've seen that in the NCAA tournament. I've seen Kiera Wheeler struggle in the paint against Stanford, right? Like, it's not just go get a big player, now everything's good. That's not how it works. But if I know the majority of the people in my conference struggle against size, I would think that if I go get size, they would struggle against me, which would then lead to me being able to win the conference, win the tournament, and be back in this situation and where that size would then benefit me again. So the size, recruiting bigger players, would allow you to dominate your conference, which would then bring you to the NCAA tournament and would then help you in the NCAA tournament. It sounds like it's just an all-around good thing. What's the con in it? I don't see it. But the overall struggles, finishing near the rim, that goes for guards, that goes for bigs, that goes for slashers, that goes for post work, and then also just size, period. You know, and I don't want to use Grambling as the example, but I do think that Grambling suffered the worst because they had to go against Zach Edey, and a lot of teams in the country have nothing to do or nothing that can stop a 7'4" big. Excuse me. I thought it was a sneeze coming, but Dante Jackson had the quote that I think, remember, Edey's a special case, but I think that Jackson's quote is a great summarization of what a problem is. He said, we're just not equipped to play him. We don't see Zach Edey. We don't see anyone as physical or as dominant as him. And he's speaking about the size component. That's the truth. Now go get you somebody that's similar to Zach Edey. As you push forward, let's look at Jackson State women's basketball, who said we are going to recruit size. And I think because of that, you see the biggest pro of their game against UConn. But then there's also some cons that led to a 20-point loss. So let's look at both of those as we continue with Locked On HBCU. Today's episode is brought to you by Nissan. Y'all know what it is. We're breaking down the March Madness brackets with our friends at Nissan. Each week, we pick a team that stands out and a team that's pushed it farther than the rest. Just like any of the all-new 2024 Nissan SUVs. These guys were able to take it to the next level, and I look at the Oakland Golden Grizzlies, who for me are the obvious Nissan Rogue. They absolutely surprised us in the first round with an upset over the Kentucky Wildcats. Sorry, Calipari, but this gives them their biggest win in program history. They say win life, go rogue, and that's exactly what Oakland has done here. Also, it's not in California. But take the Nissan Rogue, Pathfinder, or Armada. You can take it from Michigan, where Oakland actually is, or you can take it to California, where Oakland, the city, is, and find your next big adventure by looking at nissanusa.com. Today's episode is also brought to you by FanDuel. And FanDuel is the official sports book of the Locked On Podcast Network. Now, I read somewhere that there's nobody who still has their bracket intact. That's what I heard. There's no perfect brackets anymore. So say bye-bye to your busted bracket and say hello to FanDuel, where you can make every moment more, because FanDuel doesn't care that you busted out in the first round. They don't care that you made it to the fifth round. Like, they don't care about any of that. It's a game-by-game basis. No need for perfection. Just choose the next game that you want to put some money on. And it's simple. You have the live game, same game parlays, everything in between. Go to fanduel.com/locked on. That's fanduel.com/locked on. You'll be able to make every moment more. If you're new to FanDuel, that's okay, because this is a perfect time. There's games every day, all day, and there's more ways to make your money. But if on the first game you put down a $5 winning bet, you get $200 back in bonus bets. That's $200 back in bonus bets if you're new to fanduel.com/locked on. As we continue rolling on today's episode of Locked On HBCU, I appreciate you for making this your first listen of the day. Every day for your second listen, make sure you're checking out Locked On College Basketball. The Bracket Breakdown Show is now available on the Locked On College Basketball podcast. The experts, Andy Patton and Isaac Shade, who we did just have on the show just last week, will break down their brackets, discuss everything you should know, and be able to fill out a winning bracket or winning bracket thus far or going forward in this year's NCAA tournament. You can get it wherever you listen to your podcast. I want to look at the pros and cons from Jackson State's first round matchup versus UConn. Okay. This was a 20-point loss, and it may be hard to look at some pros, but I actually want to kick it off with the pros. I just alluded to the increase of size that Jackson State made sure to put into their lineup. And there's no better example than Angel Jackson. And Angel Jackson, for me, was the biggest pro from Jackson State's game versus University of Connecticut. And one player can't solve it all, right? And we're going to get to what went wrong. One player can't solve it all, but I thought the Angel Jackson looked really good on, what was that, Saturday? Yeah, Saturday at noon for me. That was a very impressive performance, because the size was the number one thing that I was looking at. And I said Jackson State was trying to ensure that if they lost, it wasn't because of a lack of size. And I don't think that's of any consolation to them, but you didn't lose because of lack of size. What Tamika Reed was thinking, I do believe worked. It just so happens that Paige Beckers is Paige Buckets. It just so happens that Aaliyah Edwards is going to be a first-round pick this year, and they're really good players. But the battle between Edwards and Jackson was one that I was paying a lot of attention to, and I think it's one that Jackson handled her own in, and I don't really think that that's debatable. When it came to Aaliyah Edwards' best production, the best thing that I thought Aaliyah Edwards did was operating from outside of the paint, whether that was assists, whether that was driving, whether that was steals on a fast break. But when Angel Jackson was in the game, I thought she did a really good job defending Aaliyah Jackson in the paint. Got a couple of blocks. I think she should have got a third, but they called a foul on that. I didn't think that was a particularly good call, but she still got 2 blocks. And you've seen a couple of, I don't want to go in theirs, right? Where somebody's driving in and they see Angel Jackson, I don't want to go in there. That's what that is. And I thought that Angel Jackson did a great job affecting points. It wasn't always affecting shots, but it was them saying, I don't want to have to go in there and try to see if I can get a bucket. She was a true rim protector on Saturday on a huge stage. We talk about people missing at the basket and them doing it, and it wasn't seemingly forced. It seemed like an unforced error. That to me, that is kind of like the moment being too big. That's you being in your head a little bit. Angel Jackson was not in her head. I think she did a great job defending Aaliyah Edwards when she was in the game. Offensively, I thought she did a good job stepping out to the elbow. Thought she did a good job stepping out to right, not quite a 3-pointer, but some really good mid-range shots. She ended with 13 points. This was a good game for Angel Jackson. I thought that this was very impressive. And if we're talking about get money games, we're talking about games to really show out, because trust me, people are looking at Aaliyah Edwards and Paige Beckers. They are. And in this game, I think it would be pretty difficult not to also notice Angel Jackson, especially when she has some good defensive plays on Aaliyah Edwards. Now let's get into what went wrong. And I think it was the reliance on the three-point shot. Let me look at what the final three-point percentage was. Jackson State is not a big three-point team. That's not what they do a lot. But they end up shooting 6 of 27 for 22.2%. I don't think that's a little bit below where they normally shoot. I think, if I'm not mistaken, coming into the game, I think it was like 27. I could be wrong. But like that, this wasn't a great game for them, to be very clear. That's not a big thing for them. That's not a great part of their game for them. So I didn't like that they were relying on that so early, because I believe that shooting the three-point shot is what shot them out of their rhythm in the first quarter. And that was what really did them in. You could not come in and dig a ditch. You could not come in and dig a ditch against the University of Connecticut, because you weren't going to get out of it. But unfortunately, they dug a ditch and they weren't able to get out of it. And what I believe kept having the shovel go in and throwing dirt across your shoulder, get that dirt off your shoulder, but throwing dirt over your shoulder, is there was a period where it felt like all but one shot, like 6 or 7 shots were three-pointers, 5 or 6 shots were three-pointers, and none of them went down. That's not what you do. That is not what Jackson State does. But there was a period in which they relied on it, and I believe it was to their detriment. Now, here's the ugly thing is, now you get yourself into a loop, because you're taking so many shots and you're not getting stops. So when you're taking these three-pointers and you're missing and you're not getting stops, your deficit is growing, right? So you're just growing and growing and growing and growing. So now you feel like, I got to take threes because I got to make up this deficit quick. So I don't know if that kind of sunk in for them. But I felt like the three-point shots at the beginning of the game is what really made up that deficit. So the motivation becomes different, because at first you just putting up threes because maybe you like them. And some of them were good shots. Don't get me wrong. Some of them were good looks, and I'm not mad at them for taking it. But there was also a good amount in which you settled for threes. And it almost felt like you searched for threes. I wish they would have attempted to get into the paint more. Who knows how that would have worked out for them? I just spoke about the lack of finishing near the rim. But I would have liked to seen Jackson State attack the paint, give a little bit more of a threat towards the interior of the court. But it seemed like they were comfortable being on the perimeter, shooting up a bunch of threes. I thought that was very disjointed offense in the first quarter. And I think it was offense that led to them really having a hole they couldn't come back out of. We've seen them come back against LSU, but just off the top of my head, I think that this UConn team is probably better than that LSU team from that season. Just from what I remember in the buzz around, like, I'm not watching a bunch of LSU women's basketball at that time. There was no Angel Reese at that time. There was no Flaw at that time. There was a lot of it was drastically different, right? This was the year prior to them winning the NCAA tournament. And I know Paige Becker, so maybe a little bit of name recognition has a part to play in that. But you weren't coming back on this team. Paige Beckers was too good. Aaliyah Edwards too good. They had this girl, I think her name was Shade. But she was knocking down threes in the corner. It was too good. Had a career high in points. You could not take that many threes. I just think it was a reliance. That's it. And it dug a ditch that you weren't able to get out of. Now, as you push forward, we're not done with this game, but I want to look at head coach Gino Auriemma's, because that's the UConn head coach. I want to look at his comments about Jackson State's coach, scheduling, and seeding as we continue with Locked On HBCU. Today's episode is brought to you by LinkedIn. And LinkedIn is not just another job board. LinkedIn has a vast network of over 1 billion professionals, which makes them the best place to hire. It gives you access to professionals that you can't find anywhere else. And LinkedIn does that, all while making the process extremely easy. Nobody wants to struggle, right? Like, raise your hand if you want to struggle, because LinkedIn helps you find the candidates that are the right fit for your team for faster and for free. It's free of charge. It's all reward, no risk. Hiring is easy When you have that many quality candidates to pick from, and it's so easy that 86% of the small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. That's one day. Go to linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. Try your luck. If you're not a small business using LinkedIn, you better not have a void at all. As we're wrapping up today's episode of Locked on HBCU, I appreciate you for making this your first listen of the day every day. Also, making it all the way to segment 3, and I appreciate you 2 times due for that. Thank you. Thank you. I truly do appreciate it. Now, I want to get to some of Coach Gino's comments, right? And Gino is the UConn head coach. And he made some comments about Jackson State after the game that were positive. Like, these are good comments. These are comments that we need. It's about head coach Tamika Reed. It's about Jackson State and the SWAC scheduling, the SWAC status, and some of the problems, right? And I have a suggestion at the end that I want to give about how to fix some things in the NCAA tournament. And maybe I'm a fool for it. Maybe I'm being optimistic. Maybe my HBCU ties make me desire this a little bit more, but I do think it's a good idea. Even with all of that, I can acknowledge all of the reasons I may be biased, but I genuinely think that this is a good idea that nobody will accept. But let's look at Tamika Reed, because according to Gino, them coaches up there in the Power 5, 4, however many power conferences it is now, they need to stop rotating the same coaches who got fired at the other place and did X, Y, and Z and then came up here. How about the person who had done the whole alphabet? How about that? Let's look at Tamika Reed, because for Gino, he tired of seeing the same faces in different places. Let's get somebody like Reed, who has done a quality job at a mid-major, and bring her up. And I'm very happy that I didn't see the same reactions that I felt like I've seen in years past, right? Anytime people have said, oh, we need to get that HBCU coach to a bigger school, people have always not really understood the thought process of the person speaking. And I think they took offense to it. I'm glad that there was no offense taken this time. It seemed like people were just like, yeah, Tamika Reed is that good. That is any coach who's on a power 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 level who says that coach should be a ACC coach, don't take offense. That is a huge compliment. They're saying that you have a great coach. I think that many of us feel like at some point Coach Reed is going to depart to go to a bigger program. So I'm just glad that the reaction wasn't bad. I'm not going to get on the high horse with it and whatnot. But yeah, she's phenomenal. The second thing is the perception of the conference and of the school. And Gino said this. He said they go on the road against the best teams, quote unquote, probably lose, and the reputation is they're good in their league, but they don't compete nationally. Jackson State and some of the programs have proven they can go on the road and compete, right? So I really want to have this conversation, and I think I want to have it with Gerald, right? Y'all know that's my guy, right? And I think I want to have this conversation with Gerald as far as the collective versus the individual, and the value of having a great HBCU team versus a bunch of good HBCU teams. And obviously, I would like to have a great with a bunch of good. And that goes for multiple sports, but mostly football and basketball, men's and women's. But that's kind of what you see here, because he's speaking about, hey, they don't want to schedule a team like Jackson State. So now the net rankings, that's how these things are decided. The net rankings are how these tournament seedings are decided. They don't go in the favor of Jackson State because their conference, because that's who he's talking about when he said they. He was talking about, when he said they, he was talking about everybody else in the conference. He said, and I didn't put this quote, but I remember it, and I think it's good for context. Gino said Jackson State then plays the teams in their conference, and they go on the road and probably lose, right? So it's very difficult. Anyway, I'm going to save this for some of the other conversation. I'm going to hop on the phone with G at some point and see if we can have this conversation. This is what I would like to change. And Isaac Shea made that exact point when he came on the show, by the way, about how teams don't really want to schedule that and how it hurts the net rankings. I believe there should be a minimum seeding for an automatic qualifier. Not just talking about Jackson State, not just talking about Norfolk, Grambling, Howard, none of that. There should be a minimum seeding for all automatic qualifiers in the NCAA tournament. Now, one could say, have them just be the top 32. From a competitive standpoint, I don't think that's great. Like it just results in the same thing, because if you have the 30, then you're gonna have the at-larges who are slightly lower, and you can still see UConn versus Jackson State. I've always said you put the teams in the middle of the pack, we'll see if they can win games then. Because I think that if you're not putting them against the best team in the Big East, like, yeah, I think they could win a game, right? But you just make it just the top 8 seeds are always the automatic qualifiers, because I think you get 32 of them. So that would end up being seeds 1 through 8. But at the worst, you get a home game. And on a monetary status, you get some money from that, right? I don't know how big the payout is from having a home NCAA tournament game. This only applies to the women, because the men have neutral sites from the jump. Women, I believe they don't go into the round of 16. So I think in the round of 16 is when you then go to a neutral site. From a monetary point, I think that it has some value. From a competitive standpoint, I wouldn't mind saying you can't be lower than a 12 seed, because everybody's saying, oh, da, 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 da. If they're better, they'll win. If those teams are truly better, they'll win. Is it really that big of a deal? My personal suggestion is that all automatic qualifiers should have a minimum seeding. Let's just say 12. And I can guarantee you see some of these mid-majors at 12 going against, what would that be, a 6 seed? It's a completely different conversation. Or 5 seed is a completely different conversation. I bet you some of these mid-majors will have significantly better luck against a 5 seed. If I looked it up right now, I bet you there's been, I don't have to bet you in the women's side, a 14 has never won in the first round. A 15 has never won in the first round. A 16 has won once in the first round. I think the 12 seed has won, like, it's definitely double digits. So I believe that if you put these mid-majors on a 12 and up, right? Let's just say that automatic qualifiers are 12, 10, 11. You might have a couple of at-larges, because that's 48 spots, 32 automatic qualifiers. Some of the at-larges are going to be better. Let's mix that in. I think that you will see way more success amongst the mid-majors in the NCAA tournament when they're not having to slay Goliath every single time they get into the freaking tournament. That's my personal opinion. And if those teams are better, then they'll still win. They'll still win. Like I think it's an overall W. That's my personal opinion, and I know that it won't happen. Matter of fact, Greg Sankey, the commissioner of the SEC, said, forget what the mouth of the South is talking about. I want to go the complete opposite direction and get rid of all automatic qualifiers. We're going to look at that on tomorrow's episode as we continue our March Madness coverage. So on tomorrow, we'll be looking at the impact of potentially taking out all automatic qualifiers. So I appreciate you for making this your first listen of the day every day, sticking with me through March Madness as we wrap this thing up, and also talk about Norfolk State making it to the CIT final. So we'll get into all of these things in the upcoming days. In the meantime, in between time, until the next time we hear each other, family, take care, stay blessed. Peace.